Now, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator, we can get you to weigh in on the Biden story later on if you want to, but I want to start with the news that you have been denied a visa by the Russians, you and your Republican colleague Ron Johnson. You've been a critic of the Kremlin's for a while now, but were you surprised to be effectively made persona non grata by the Kremlin?
I guess I wasn't surprised. I have been a pretty strong critic of the Russian government and of the Kremlin. I was there in Ukraine 3 different times with John McCain during 2013 and 2014 as they were spinning themselves out of Russia's orbit. And I've been critical of their manipulation of the U.S. election and their continued attempts to do so. But at the same time, I was going to Russia not just as a critic, but someone who really believes that the United States and Russia need to have a functional relationship. We need to be working together on things like nuclear nonproliferation. We need to both be at the table to try to figure out a path forward for peace in a place like Syria. And so, you know, if someone like me isn't allowed into Russia, someone who's been a critic but is also willing to reach out and find some common ground, then I don't know how we repair this relationship. So I wasn't surprised, but I was certainly disappointed. And if Ron Johnson and myself, 2 fairly mainstream foreign policy thinkers, are being denied visas, then I'm not sure who Russia is ever going to let in.
Senator Murphy, it's Rick Stengel in New York. And yes, you have been a staunch opponent of Russian disinformation, something we talked about when I was at the State Department. And you've been a staunch supporter of Ukraine. I think you first went there with Senator McCain in 2013, 2014. I have kind of a double-barreled question for you. You have a really smart thread this morning about how we can support Ukraine and how critical that is to the future of the free world. I'd like to have you summarize that. And also, I want to ask you about something that we worked on together that your legislation created, the Global Engagement Center, which was partially created to counter Russian disinformation and disinformation all around the world.
Well, as I was sitting here waiting to go on the air, I retweeted you, Rick, on this question of U.S. policy towards Ukraine. And my thread that I put on late last night is simple. It's that the president's consideration of withdrawing security aid for Ukraine is disastrous. Right now, you have a new president of Ukraine that Putin is actively testing. And the message that the president is sending by teasing the idea of ending our security partnership with Ukraine is really harmful to a new leader there. But my worry is that we often over-obsess over our military partnership with Ukraine. Ultimately, Russia doesn't want to march on the Ukrainian capital. They want to economically and politically break Ukraine. And we are offering lots of military support, but not a lot of economic and political support to Ukraine. So if we really want to make sure that Ukraine stays independent and sovereign, then we have to be talking about other forms of assistance rather than just military aid. And sometimes this place obsesses over it. And one of the things we can do is continue to stand up this center that we worked on, the Global Engagement Center, which helps countries like Ukraine fight Russian propaganda. And my hope is that we can continue to build bipartisan support for that anti-propaganda effort.
Senator Murphy, this is Clint Watts in New York. You know, this week, again, it was interesting to see the president essentially advocating for Russia at the G7. This isn't unusual. We've seen him essentially take sides with Russia against our own intelligence community and against our allies in different contexts before. But just for the benefit of the doubt, is there anything that the White House has communicated to you and the other senators about why we would want to bring Russia back into these relationships? And how does that affect our alliances with all of our NATO, EU partners? What is your perspective on that, having watched what went down this week?
Well, I haven't heard anything from the White House, in part because I don't think there is any official American policy. This is once again foreign policy by stream of consciousness, foreign policy by Twitter. And I've said that it's not preposterous to talk about bringing Russia back into the G7. We should want Russia to be at that table having conversations about the future of the world. But we should be making that decision in coordination with the other members of that group. And we should be saying to the Russians that if you want back into the club, then you have to be willing to take some steps on de-escalating tensions in a place like eastern Ukraine or Crimea. So, you know, there's no reason why you shouldn't be talking about Russia coming back in. But the fact that we're freelancing and talking about doing it on our own further exacerbates this tension between the United States and all of the other great powers around the world, which makes us weaker and, frankly, incentivizes everybody else, from France to Russia to England, to make plans without us, to just work around the United States.
And if Russia were to re-enter the G7, then making it the G8 again, that means Vladimir Putin would set foot in the United States at the president's golf course in Doral, Florida. So let's not lose sight of that. But, Senator, I wanted to get you on a different matter, switching the topic of guns. I know one is near and dear to you. It has now been a few weeks since the shootings in El Paso and Dayton. There has yet to be any legislative response to that, of course. The Senate remains out of session. But what are you hearing? Are you hearing anything, any signs of progress whatsoever in your communications with your colleagues, Republican colleagues on the Hill, but also the White House? President Trump has made calls in recent weeks about background checks, other things. What can you tell us? What's the latest?
Well, this is a different moment. I mean, the anti-gun violence movement has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger over the years. Part of the reason that Democrats won back control of the House of Representatives is because all of a sudden guns is an issue that swing voters vote on, that turns out young people. And the president knows that. Republicans know that. And so we are at the table as we speak this week with the White House and a handful of Republicans and Democrats in Congress, including my office, trying to work out a compromise on expanding background checks. This is the first time that we have ever been in active negotiations with Republicans, and certainly this White House, since 2013 to dramatically expand the number of background checks that are done in this country. And while I'd still put the chances of getting an agreement at less than 50-50, it is significant that the White House is very interested in trying to come up with a bipartisan deal. I'm not sort of overflowing with trust of this White House, because they still are talking to the NRA as much as they're talking to people like me. But it is significant that we're talking, and I'm going to stay at the table with the White House for as long as it takes.
Senator Susan Del Percio here in New York. Just switching back to the Ukraine a moment. I can't help but think in the headlines recently, we know that Rudy Giuliani, one of the president's political allies, has gone over to the Ukraine with the goal of finding dirt on the president's political opponents, more specifically former Vice President Biden's son. How concerned are you that knowing that the president is as transactional as he is, that he could be holding up this aid specifically for that reason until he gets some information? As you said, it's a new president there. They have new leadership. Maybe this is the way the president can, if not corrupt him, at least kind of get what he wants out of him.
So Giuliani's visits to Ukraine should be a red alarm moment for the United States Senate. I've sent a letter to the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Jim Risch, asking him to conduct an investigation into Rudy Giuliani's trips and visits to Ukraine. I know from friends in Ukraine that the new president there and the new administration there are very confused. They don't know who is actually speaking for the president, and certainly Giuliani and others are making it sound as if they are speaking for the United States of America when they ask for these bogus investigations of the Biden family. And yes, I am very concerned that the president is willing to hold up military aid to Ukraine in order to get his political priorities undertaken by the Ukrainian government. Now, that would be patently illegal. That would be impeachable if it were true. But I think we have to put two and two together. We have to look at Giuliani's visits. We have to look at this very bizarre announcement about the suspension of aid to Ukraine and worry that the two may be linked. I don't have evidence that they are, but I'm worried about it.
Okay. The Senator posted his thread on Twitter on Ukraine last night. It's worth a read. Senator Chris Murphy, thank you very much for joining us. Coming up on Morning Joe.
Beating Donald Trump is not enough. We got to have bigger aspirations than that. Beating Donald Trump is the floor. It's not the ceiling. Beating Donald Trump may get us out of the valley, but it doesn't get us to the mountaintop. What's going to decide this election is not what he does or people that disagree with us do. It's how we are going to act, how we are going to not be reactivists waiting till something happens and then suddenly realizing that there's a cause. We have to be activists.
Cory Booker in California, and as we gear up for the upcoming elections, a new book argues that the country must consider future generation when making today's decision. Morning Joe will be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.